My job right now is to first tell you that this is a project run by the Atlantic Council, the Pinchuk Foundation, the Victor Pinchuk Foundation, the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. And you can follow the daily results of our work monitoring foreign interference in Ukraine's presidential elections at ukraineelects.org. ukraineelects.org, which is updated daily and even more than once a day. And with that, I'd like to introduce both Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Prime Minister of Denmark, the former Secretary General of NATO, who runs the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. And he will be followed by Svetlana Hrichenko, who's the Director of National Programs at the Victor Pinchuk Foundation. Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Herbst, for that introduction. Ukraine's election season presents Ukrainians with very clear choices whether to continue along the reform path of the past 5 years and who to lead them through the pivotal years ahead. I very much hope that Ukrainians choose to stay the course on reforms, and in return it will be in our interests in the Euro-Atlantic family to continue Ukraine's integration. Most importantly, these are choices to be made by Ukrainians and Ukrainians alone, free from external pressures, fear, or coercion by foreign malign powers. Since 2016, we have seen at least 10 cases of foreign election meddling across the West. And given the high stakes and past experience, we cannot underestimate the risk of foreign interference in Ukraine's elections. There is no doubt the country is a target. In many ways, it is the target. Moscow has used Ukraine as testing ground for its interference playbook before, and it will do so again. We have seen full asymmetrical warfare already deployed, from ongoing aggression in the Donbass and escalation in the Sea of Azov, protests organized by pro-Russian proxies alongside under-the-radar disinformation campaigns, and regular hacking attempts and cyber attacks. None of this is new for Ukraine. In fact, most of it has become a daily fact of life. Moscow's meddling campaign may not yield a pro-Kremlin candidate, at least not in the presidential campaign, if we trust opinion polls. But I suspect Russia's goal is not to elect their president in Ukraine. Its aim is to delegitimize the election process altogether, to undermine the winner and sow doubt among both Ukrainians and the international community about whether this was a free and fair vote, to reinforce the narrative that Ukraine is a failed country whose institutions cannot be trusted and where everything is for sale, including the election results. This is the picture Russia is trying to paint through its interference campaign. And this is the picture it wants the Ukrainians and the international community to see. We will see even more of this when the parliamentary campaign kicks off later this year. The radar is where meddling is likely to give Russia and others more bang for their buck, either by supporting candidates who will back Russia or candidates who will block progress, playing the role of Russia's useful idiots. The aim is to ensure the new parliament is even more fragmented and anti-reformist than the current one. Chaos would serve Russia's interests more than any single Ukrainian politician or a party. And that is why the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity decided to team up with the Atlantic Council and the Victor Pinchuk Foundation to form the Ukrainian Election Task Force. But I would like to end on the wider point of why this work and these elections matter to the European Union. 5 years ago, Ukrainians took to the streets to demand a different path, a path of freedom, sovereignty, and self-determination. The so-called Heavenly 100 paid the ultimate price for that choice. And they have been joined by almost 13,000 people killed in the Donbass, 1.6 million people displaced, countless political prisoners in Russia, including Oleg Sentsov, not to mention 24 sailors held illegally since November. The kleptocracy in Moscow has a stake in impeding a free and successful Ukraine, because autocrats and dictators fear freedom. But these are values and principles on which our democracies are built, and we should defend today, especially in our own neighborhood. And it is in our own interest for Ukraine to be a stable, modern, and sovereign nation too. That is why we have supported Ukraine's path to a brighter, more independent future. And with this work, we will continue to defend Ukraine's interests to decide its own destiny through the ballot box. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, as a Ukrainian, I want to thank you for your interest in the development of the country. Thank you for being here with us. It's really hard to overestimate the importance of the upcoming elections in Ukraine this year. It's really critical for us, for Ukrainians, to have an opportunity to vote fairly and without any interference in our voting. We want to thank Victor Pinchuk Foundation. We want to thank our partner who supported the initiative of Victor Pinchuk and created the Ukrainian Election Task Force, Atlantic Council, and Transatlantic Commission of Elections Integrity. We also want to thank David Crimea for leading the efforts and for monitoring the potential interference on a daily basis. Also, we want to thank our partner organizations who joined the project: StopFake, Razumkov Centre, Detector Media, who is doing the hard work on a daily basis to find out if the elections are fair and if somebody is interfering. As Ambassador Herb said, we are sharing our results via our website that we created, Ukrainian Election Task Force. We also distribute the newsletter, and we already have many information to share, and we'll be happy if you could read and get informed about it. And the final results of our work for the presidential election will introduce in Kyiv in this year in May. Thank you once again for being here with us, and thank you for your interest in Ukraine.
After you. It was responsible for working on disinformation efforts. And then we have Alexei Melnik from the Razumkov Centre, who watches Kremlin kinetic activities, which is a fancy word for military-related things. And with that, David, you're in charge of this effort. Your sense as to the main findings to date.
Great, John. Thank you very much, and thanks to you and to Geisha, Leona, and everyone at the Atlantic Council for asking me to be part of this, and my thanks to Anders and to Svetlana and Victor Pinchuk for having this idea, for launching this project, which I think is incredibly important for all of us, because I think as we have seen over the years, what happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. It affects all of us. Ukraine, in fact, is often a testing ground for what the Kremlin decides it wants to do to try to destabilize democracies and countries transitioning and moving closer toward the Euro-Atlantic community. And we see what happens in Ukraine then tried elsewhere. And certainly the efforts in 2014 to hack into the Central Election Commission, to interfere into the 2 elections in Ukraine in that year, were then replicated elsewhere, including in my country, in the United States, of course, in 2016, and even tried in 2018 to less effect. So it is critically important that we pay attention to what's happening in Ukraine in terms of interference by outside forces, and the predominant force, needless to say, is Putin's regime. What is striking, and I think we should not take for granted, is that none of us knows who's going to win the Ukrainian election. And that is something that I think is noteworthy in a region where elections are often preordained. The result is known before voters go to the polls. And that is something certainly Mr. Putin wants to maintain in his own country. But that is something Ukrainians, I think, should take great pride in, that they will go to vote on March 31st and then possibly in a second round, and they will determine who their next president is going to be. And that's exactly how it should be. And that should also be the case when it comes to the Rada elections in the fall. Our project just quickly has focused on a range of outside interference, from kinetic to disinformation to cyber to broader efforts. And as John had said, we have been tracking these efforts to interfere in the election on a daily basis. And what I think we have found is that while the Kremlin has not tried to tilt the playing field necessarily to one preferred candidate over another, they do seem to want to damage the candidacies of certain individuals. But perhaps most importantly, as Andres said, they are trying to discredit the whole process. Where elections determine a leader, where the outcome is not known, that is something that the Kremlin fears. And that is something that the Kremlin wants to raise questions about. It's also important to understand that when we talk about interference in Ukraine's election, it is inarguable that with Ukraine's territory already occupied, there is ongoing interference. With Crimea and the situation in Donbass, Ukraine is in a situation like Georgia, where its territory is occupied by an outside force, by an unwelcome outside force. And that alone constitutes interference, to the point where there are citizens in Ukraine who will not be able to participate in this election, who have been disenfranchised. And that alone will alter the outcome of the election. Paradoxically, perhaps not in the Kremlin's favor. Nevertheless, it is interference in the ability of Ukrainians to determine their own future, to select their own leaders, and that really has to be a starting point from 2014 to the present, where Russia, through a range of activities under Mr. Putin, is interfering in the election. And so we will continue to monitor this. We wanted to have this conversation today in Brussels before the vote for the first round. And we will have further events like this in Washington, April 1, the day after the first round of the election. And then we will hold an event in Ukraine in the middle of May, the date still to be determined, where we will provide our final assessment of the efforts of outside interference in Ukraine's election. I want to echo what Svetlana said. I am incredibly impressed at the turnout here today and heartened by the interest in what is happening in Ukraine and on this issue in particular. And I think it bodes well for support for Ukraine, for its aspirations to determine its own future, and to be vigilant about outside efforts to interfere not only in Ukraine's election, but in other countries' elections as well.
Okay, David, thank you. Ken, what do you see as the main lines of Kremlin activity in the cyber realm related to the elections in Ukraine?
Sure. So hello and merci beaucoup. Ça me fait toujours bien de revenir en Belgique. I'm going to need an interpreter. So cyber is just a part of everything we do, whether you're a soldier, a student, or a spy. And Russia has probably the longest and weightiest body of literature on this subject, really. In serious cyber espionage in the United States in the 80s and 90s, and then up to Estonia in 2007, when we first saw the use of cyber for geopolitical coercion, pressure, retaliation. So I was in Estonia in 2007. I was in Ukraine in 2014. And the difference in 7 years is amazing. So in 2021, it's I'm not sure what's going to happen. But the difference between Estonia 2007, which was basically some denial of service against a handful of websites, and then in Ukraine in 2014, where we saw diplomacy, business, surely on the military field, but in social media as well, and then most seriously in critical infrastructure. So every sort of stone we turned over in a big study I did for NATO a couple of years ago, we saw conflict, digital conflict in Ukraine. A good example is that U.S. diplomats had their telephone conversations captured via traditional signals intelligence and then uploaded to YouTube and announced on Twitter, right? So this is a complicated operation that takes a lot of time and forethought and capability. So I taught university as well for a couple of years in Kiev, and I'd even talk to my students and say, in your immediate social media space, do you see foreign pressure against you personally relative to the conflict? And every time, every hand went up. So it affects all of us. Devices are so intimate now. We carry a supercomputer in our pocket all the time, and these are good tracking devices, and they are a point where someone can influence you as well. So basically, it's everywhere today. And cyber is a part of everything you do as a student, or a soldier, or a spy, or a statesman. And so we can see Russia's intent and activities, both in what they say and what they do, whether it's in real space or cyberspace. They're just a reflection of each other. But there's a lot to talk about relative to what Russia's doing in Ukraine, for sure.
Ken, thank you. Katerina, we know that the Kremlin is a world leader in disinformation, and perhaps Ukraine is its foremost target. What do you see as the main narratives in the disinformation campaign?
Thank you very much for your question. Obviously, thank you everyone for coming. Well, first of all, I would have to admit that I'm very proud to represent StopFake, which started monitoring the information space in Ukraine 5 years ago. On the March the 2nd, we celebrated the 5th anniversary, meaning that we have an incredibly rich database of all the informed and recorded and debunked Russian disinformation activities in Ukraine. That is why it gives us a great database to look at not only in the past in the past recent months, when we started the election campaign, or when we started monitoring what Russians are writing about Ukrainian elections, but also to compare it with what Russians have been doing in Ukrainian information space for the last 5 years. And surprisingly, they haven't been that much active in the recent months. So there have been only few narratives that have been added to the Kremlin playbook of how to write about Ukraine and from which angle to analyze or to represent or to talk about Ukrainian events. And as it was already mentioned by other colleagues of mine, the main narratives that Russia has been using against Ukraine, both for Ukrainian audience, just as much as for Russian audience and also for international audience, are as follows. So first of all, Ukraine is a failed state in which there is a civil war going on, because in Donbass there is no Russian interference, there is only Ukrainian locals who are fighting against the fascist government in Ukraine. So basically the main narratives about Ukraine, what Russia has been how Russia has been portraying Ukraine for the past years and also in the recent months, just before the elections, would be the fragile or failed state that is fighting internal conflict, has failed all the reforms, and obviously is not welcomed by anyone in the Western society. Those narratives Russia has been continuing using in the recent months as well. Unsurprisingly, the criticism of Ukrainian authorities, all the reforms activities, the Ukrainian president, prime minister, and so on and so forth, they remain. It was also very surprising for us to monitor that Russians haven't actually started talking that much about the other candidates. From time to time, they're indeed talking about Yulia Tymoshenko during their talk shows, saying that she could be the most favorable candidate to negotiate with from Ukrainian side. Surprisingly, they don't have that much attention either with manipulations or narratives when it comes to Volodymyr Zelensky, who is currently leading in presidential polls. We would have to say that the leader remains the current president, Petro Poroshenko, when it comes both to manipulative informations, disinformation, and obviously the number of mentions on Russian television and pro-Russian media online and offline. But with the narratives that have been added in the recent months is, first of all, the questioning of the legitimacy of the process and the results of the elections as such. So the biggest amount of the disinformation activities that we've started noticing and debunking in recent 2 months, and they are piling up with every week, almost every single day closer to the elections, is all the different kinds of reports that, you know, there is a pyramid of buying voters, Ukrainian electoral system is not working, and central electoral systems are failed, and they will not be able to produce the real results. All the types of information saying that Ukrainian electoral process has already been violated, meaning that even the results that we'll have, they won't be legitimate and we shouldn't take them into account. And this is something that Russian disinformation activities, so like pro-Kremlin outlets and Kremlin directly financed outlets have been pushing for several months. But in recent weeks, I think it was the last week, when it actually reached the point when we can talk about very direct interference from the high official of Russia, because we're talking about Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who in his article to Bulgarian newspaper Trud, just before his official visit to Bulgaria, has actually repeated all of the narratives that pro-Kremlin outlets have been repeating in recent months, saying that that the electoral process, the election process, or the elections campaign is being so much full with fraud, and it already is so dark and dirty that whoever will be elected, it will be really very hard to really treat this person as a rightful president of Ukrainians. So we already see the escalation of the who is pushing the narrative, and it's really very interesting to see that something which was brought up to the public debate by some very low-profile websites, sometimes Facebook posts, stories, and so on and so forth, and later has started being circulated more actively in other media. Now is being repeated not only by very loyal Kremlin journalists, but also the high official. So this is the thing that has to be kept in mind, that really the questioning of the very process and the questioning of the result, and in general questioning the capability of Ukraine to conduct fair and just elections, meaning the questioning the very democratic essence of Ukraine and stability of the country. This is something that Russians have been pushing very actively in recent months, adding to the already existing narratives that Ukraine has been doing very badly in the economical front, in the reforms front, and obviously as a stable state in general.
Katerina, thank you very much. Alexei, your response for looking at the military end, whether it's the war in Donbass, Russian maneuvers in the Sea of Azov, or for that matter, subversion within the country. What would you say are the main lines of their activity these days?
Well, first of all, I would say that our team tried to, at the beginning, separate all the events and Russian activities from what was related to the conflict itself and what would have direct impact on the elections. And I would say it was probably not the right approach from the beginning, because it would be artificial to separate Russian activities, I mean, aimed at the Ukrainian elections and the conflict itself. And Ukraine, as we all know, had pretty good record as a peaceful country for more than 20 years, because it was no blood from the beginning of Soviet Union collapse. There were no major incidents. There were a few incidents with Russia until 2014. And, you know, when you ask question why Russia attacked Ukraine, and then you probably would try to understand the Russian strategy. And if you have a chance to read the recent speech by General Gerasimov, Russian Chief of General Staff, and you would find probably a number of answers to this very hard question. First of all, and it's been said a couple of times today that Ukraine been used as a testing ground, as a target, but I would probably add that Ukraine is also a great source of knowledge and experience how to counteract Russian aggression. And for instance, if you create, I mean, what is the Russian strategy? General Gerasimov said that, expressing his understanding of the contemporary warfare, and he said that, you know, all the means like energy, cyber, disinformation is used as a military instruments. But at the end of the day, when it comes, they cannot achieve their objectives, they would use military. And that's what happened in Ukraine, because Russians tried to undermine Ukraine at least very actively from 2005, and then they decided to attack Ukraine. And we can now say that creating a conflict on the territory, it affects the whole internal political life in the country, the whole political agenda, and especially, for instance, in the time of elections, people are looking for this peace recipe, and it affects the political agenda of Ukrainian politicians. It affects opinion of Ukrainian public. That's just one example. We also saw some very, let's say, precise example of Russian kinetic actions aimed at the Ukrainian election. Kerch Strait incident, which happened last November. There was the first time when Russia openly used its military power against Ukraine. And Ukrainian government reaction was absolutely predicted. The martial law was declared. And according to Ukrainian constitution, the elections had to be postponed. That was kind of this very clear example. There are many other examples or cases which, you know, are not so obvious for the moment. Just give you a few. For instance, one of I wouldn't call him by name, but one of the potential winners of the presidential elections, he is at the investigation of the Russian Investigative Committee as committing war crimes. And can you imagine, again, if this person is elected as the president in Ukraine and he is under Russian investigation, and I mean, you shouldn't have big imagination to happen, how much time it would take for Putin to decide to meet this war criminal who is now a president of Ukraine, what kind of messages would be sent around. Another well-known case is about Ukraine's decision to ban Russian electoral observers. And when you, I mean, what's wrong? And many Europeans would ask questions, why don't you let Russians to go and see, how Ukraine conducts its elections? But just a little research, when you look at some of these persons that were going to come to Ukraine to be as observers, and you will find information like this Общество свободных выборов, Russian Organization for Free Elections, I don't remember exactly this name, and you see their governing board. That person who is in charge of Russian observers is the Russian general, retired general, but still general. And an executive director is former, there is no former, as we know, KGB agent. So, and they send their people to observe Ukrainian elections. Come on. And I would also recommend you to visit our website because just a limit of time I wouldn't. There are many other examples when you can see some of the Russian actions either directly aimed at to influence Ukrainian elections or the developments that we have to watch closely in order to be aware and to prevent as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alexei. Let's follow up though, Alexei, with you on one of the points you've made. You talked about Kremlin military activities, the ongoing war that they are leading in Donbass, as designed to, in effect, shake the Ukrainian people and to produce a winner in the election that would be susceptible to Kremlin influence. Do you think they're in any way successful with this? Do you think the Ukrainian people are shaken by this?
You remember, Ambassador, when we discussed this project many months ago, and what we one of the conclusions that we came to, that Russia would use probably both escalation and de-escalation. And I think that one of the reasons that the situation on the front line is relatively stable, and we had even a couple of days of real ceasefire, is because it doesn't serve the Russian interest nowadays, because they know if there is a significant escalations, they will probably help President Poroshenko to be re-elected, and they already expressed their opinion about, that they would not be happy to see Poroshenko. I'm not a supporter of Poroshenko, just saying what the Russian tactics are behind these actions. But I would probably again try to encourage you to read General Gerasimov's speech, because what he mentioned in his speech Ukraine only once. He mostly talked about this new American strategy, and about the experience in Syria, but I just saw Ukraine after each of his sentence. And let me just give you a few of them. Internal destabilization with simultaneous high precision strikes. It hadn't happened yet, and I hope it is not going to happen. But again, in a time of elections, I wouldn't rule out such a possibility. Preventive measures as an active defense strategy. And what they tasted successfully, by Gerasimov's opinion, is humanitarian operation as a new form of military operation. Limited action strategy. And this is something that we should be very serious, and something that we can expect to happen in Ukraine, especially in the time of elections.
Thank you. Katerina, turning back to disinformation. You laid out some of the new themes that have appeared in the run-up to the elections. What can you tell us about the methods by which they distribute disinformation and how they deliver it, not just in Ukraine, which of course is their first audience, but also in Western Europe?
Thank you very much for your question. Before answering that, I would actually like to very briefly remind you that back in 2014, we already experienced Russian non-recognition of the results of Ukrainian presidential elections, because we had early presidential elections in May 2014 because of the extraordinary situation after Revolution of Dignity and the fact that Yanukovych back then left the country. Russians, in a way, didn't recognize Poroshenko or question the legitimacy of the very presidential election, saying, look, we have a legitimate president. Well, he's staying in Russia in Rostov, but it doesn't matter. He's still a president. You haven't done any legal procedure against him. The fact is that and it was quite a problematic issue, because this was the moment when we already had seen a very severe escalation in eastern Ukraine. It was already after MH17 tragedy, and Russians still were in a way refusing to talk directly on the official level with Ukrainians. And in a way, the moment when Russia has unofficially recognized President Poroshenko as a president of Ukraine and as someone with whom Putin can talk was actually in Minsk during the negotiation of Minsk agreement. Before that, I would say for roughly 4 or 5 months, we lived in a situation when the biggest neighbor of Ukraine and also an aggressor country said, well, there is no president in this country. There is no one for us to talk to. So we know that these strategies that Russians are using right now against Ukraine, this is nothing new in a way. So there could be even some period after Ukrainian presidential elections this time when Russia could play this non-recognition card, which also influences not only the bilateral relations between Ukraine and Russia, but also the way Ukraine is being treated on the international arena by our other partners as well. And also briefly very much about Russian activities and how how Russia is being actually discussed during Ukrainian presidential elections campaign. The fact is that Russia is one of the main topics, and that is why, rightfully, my colleague has mentioned that we have seen a very great de-escalation in eastern Ukraine, because so far one of the hottest topics of all the discussions or questions which are being asked to our presidential candidates is how are you gonna work with Russia or not work with Russia? What are you gonna do with Minsk agreement? And this is one of the main differences, or like the hot points which differentiates the three leaders of our presidential runoff and obviously the rest of the candidates. The very basic question whether you will negotiate with Russia or not, and how will you continue the current path. But going back to your question, how the disinformation is being disseminated, in this regards, actually Russians are doing nothing new. We have seen in the last few years that, unfortunately for us, but also maybe also for the learning purposes, both of Ukraine and for the Western society, Russia has been very flexible and has started and has been learning very quickly. So up to the moments when there was very high level of escalation in eastern Ukraine, when, for example, we seen Kerch Strait, when the occupation of Crimea was undergoing, Russians mostly used all the disinformation channels they had. We are talking about Russian TV stations, which were still available in Ukraine. Now they are officially banned they are sanctioned and banned from the cable network, but you can still watch them online or via satellite. Then obviously all the online resources and the entire network of bots and trolls who are simply used to disseminate the information. So up from the moments when Russia is very actively, kinetically or physically on the ground, is attacking Ukraine, Russian disinformation networks and channels are simply used to whitewash the crimes or hide the crimes or pollute the information space in order to people not to actually be able to go to see through the polluted disinformation to see what is going on in real life. In other times, Russians are not using direct entry points coming from Russia, but they're using all their proxies in Ukraine. Or recently what they started using useful idiots from Western countries, or like the rest of the world, because this is also the thing about the way the Western experts, analytical centers or think tanks are being treated in Eastern Europe, but especially in Ukraine. They are being treated with a high level of trust and authority. So the strategy has a little bit shifted from Russia in recent years, is that sometimes they're using mostly Ukrainian or Western useful idiots or proxies, news channels, TV channels, newspapers, online papers, and so on and so forth in order to throw the propaganda. So we see less and less disinformation activities coming directly from Russia, targeting Ukraine. When it comes to targeting Russian population, obviously the TV is still the main source of information. And unfortunately, the narratives that Russians are using for their domestic Russian audience about Ukraine are are very, very dangerous, and actually they have been the narratives escalated recently, because a few weeks ago there was a program, one of the big talk shows in Russian television, during which they have openly live discussed their methods or different ways how to military invade Ukraine. I mean, saying that if Ukrainians aren't able to govern themselves, if they aren't able to conduct normal elections and elect a president, then what kind of country is that? Maybe we should help them govern themselves. So just imagine the level of the narratives about Ukraine on Russian television. If you switch Russian television in the prime time and you just listen to different scenarios, how to attack Kyiv from which positions and so on and so forth, and how many military units should be used against Ukraine. So to wrap up what I was talking about, mainly the methods remain the same. So quite often they use the entry point, so meaning the first time where the information was published, which would be rather a Ukrainian website. Not that much of the Russian websites are used right now, because every single time we see coming something from the Russian source, it immediately legitimizes the message. Ukrainians don't trust Russian media, they don't trust Russian websites, and so on and so forth. But something that has been published in Ukraine or in other Western countries is less questionable for them. Later on, those messages are being used either by proxy politicians or civil society activists, obviously paid, and there are different networks of those people. And the main dissemination of disinformation is actually taking place online, when bots and trolls are being used first and foremost in order to spread the false information or disinformation narratives which Russians are producing.
Thank you. Ken, coming back to cyber, we've seen stories about hacks into the Ukrainian Central Election Commission coming from Russia. What can you say about this?
So that's another example of a multi-layered or a difficult operation to pull off, right? So this is in 2014, and hackers had been targeting the infrastructure of the Electoral Commission for at least 6 months. And then at the end of the day, when the polls close, a far-right candidate is announced the winner, who had actually got very few votes, but was announced the winner, and this was immediately broadcast on Russian television, right? Suggesting a coordinated operation that requires forethought, groupthink, intelligence, analysis, and reconnaissance, and nothing like that is going to be done without approval at the highest levels, because when cyber operations sort of cross a threshold into the international ramifications arena, they have to be signed off, right, by the leadership. So that everyone points to is something that should have been a warning to the United States, even in 2016, where you could say the United States was caught completely flat-footed in attacks against democracy in the United States. But in Ukraine, you could already see an interest in undermining democracy. So not necessarily one candidate, but undermining the electoral process, so that after the election, everyone is depressed in feeling that not only within their space it may be an illegitimate leader, but then that gives them something to talk about on Russian television.
Okay, thank you. David, coming back to the senior level from which you look at this. I mean, you've watched Kremlin activities for 15 years. You had a senior position at state doing that. What do you see as the main lines of their activities in Ukraine today as they look towards the election?
I think, John, as we look at Ukraine, it started in 2004 with efforts to support an illegitimate victory by Viktor Yanukovych in that election. The crowds turning out for the Orange Revolution forced a rerun and produced a different result. And I think everything, if you will, that is called the color revolutions, that has colored the Kremlin's look at Ukraine ever since. And the very fact that Ukrainians on their own would turn out in the streets to demand better from their government, to reject a stolen election, to insist on a free and fair election. That very idea, that prospect, terrified the Kremlin. Georgia happened a year before, and we have to look at this on a regional basis with the Rose Revolution there. And to Putin, there had to have been an outside force driving people out into the streets, and that force obviously was the United States. You served in the U.S. State Department at the time, ambassador in Ukraine. I was in the State Department at the time, and all I remember is our struggle to keep up with what was happening on the ground in these countries. Forget being behind it. We were, in fact, behind it because we couldn't keep up with it. And ever since, I would argue, Putin has been determined to prevent a repeat of what happened in 2004. And instead, in 2013 and into 2014, he produced a similar kind of result. Unfortunately, in 2014, at tremendous cost in lives to Ukrainians, who again rejected the idea of a corrupt leadership that spurned an opportunity to look toward the West, to sign agreements with the European Union, and to fall under the sway of the Kremlin. And so the notion again that Ukrainians, for the second time in a decade, and I frankly can't think of another country that has done this, to turn out in the streets, the second time at enormous cost and enormous risk, demanding better from their government and demanding freedom from being under Russian influence, is something that I think is incredibly powerful, but also incredibly threatening to the Kremlin. Putin, after all, fears that what happens in Ukraine could spill over and lead to a similar outcome in Russia. And particularly with his numbers sagging in various surveys that we've seen by Levada and others, this kind of popular movement that Ukraine, I think, should be rightly proud of, is something Putin is fearful of.
Okay. You mentioned the Kremlin intervention in 2014. What has that done in terms of Ukrainian society?
Putin has generated greater support for joining NATO than Ukrainian leaders have been capable of. He is producing results in Ukraine that run counter to Russia's interests, or at least Putin's interests. He has done more to unite the country than had been done almost in the previous 20 plus years. And he has repelled his largest neighbor. It is not in Russia's national interest to have a destabilized Ukraine along its borders. It is not in Russia's national interest to see Ukraine want to move closer to the West away from Russia. But it's in Putin's interest to do these things, because Putin's interest and Russia's national interests don't always coincide. And so we have seen Putin's efforts to interfere through the invasion and through ongoing efforts to interfere in the Ukrainian politics and elections, actually bringing Ukraine more together, more interested in joining Euro-Atlantic institutions, and producing the very kinds of results that he thought he was working against.
Okay. Alexei, I think easily the most significant thing that's happened in the military area in this pre-election period was the Russian attack on the Ukrainian boats trying to transit the Straits of Kerch, or before they even tried to get transit the Straits of Kerch, and then their seizure of the vessels and the imprisoning of the prisoners. And then, of course, they issued a statement that the prisoners would not be released until after the Ukrainian elections. Would you talk about this?
Yes, indeed, that this Kerch incident probably was a clear action aimed to disturb the Ukrainian electoral process. Also, Russia keeps additional 24 prisoners, POWs, and now they are going through this psychological testing, something like, I mean, it's again act of humiliation and violation of international conventions. And it also gives us an idea that Russia using human beings again as a weapon for disinformation, as a weapon for the trading, their people. And let me remind you that it's been more than 1 year since the last exchange of prisoners. And the person who is kind of allowed by President Putin to do this humanitarian action is Victor Medvedchuk. And I think part of the reasons that Russia keeps hostages, Ukrainian hostages, in Ukraine, despite international pressure, despite obvious violation of international law, is just to let someone, to raise his ratings before parliamentary elections. So it's not going to work for presidential elections. And then, you just keep people in prison, humiliate them, and don't provide them medical care because 3 of them are wounded. Just, to get some additional points for his good friend Medvedchuk. And also let me mention a couple more points. You talk about Russian proxies. Usually when you talk about Russian proxies, this kinetic area, we mean Russian or these opolchenцы or collaborators that fight on Donbass. It's not as simple. Just a couple of examples. Russian observers. I would salute Ukrainian security service. They done tremendous job, and when I talk about Ukraine as a source of information and experience, they done some analysis how observers from different European countries serve the Russian interest, because they established the links, direct links between Italians, Germans, even Americans, who have direct contacts with people like Dugin, with some people connected to Dugin is one of ideologists of this Ruski Mir. He has no official position, but he's one of the ideologists. And another good example about Russian proxies. More than 1 year ago, there was an incident in western Ukraine when this house of Hungarian community was put on fire, and when the governor, Mr. Moskal, first said that it was done by the Polish people, he was received as like crazy guy. But 1 year after, it was the investigation, and there was a court, and it's still going on, the process. 2 Polish guys contracted and paid by German journalist, who again has direct connection with Mr. Dugin and with Russian FSB, conducted this act of vandalism against Hungarian community in western Ukraine. This is, the idea, it's not as simple when you look at Russian proxies. They can't be, with holding European passports as well. And my last point is about large-scale Russian attack. And I think we also have quite simple perception of what is the large, or this historical perception of large-scale attack. Because when my colleague talked about cyber attacks, what I learned also from our officials, that the big cyber attacks being conducted against Ukrainian energy infrastructure were like 10% of the capacities that Russia could provide. So it was just tasting. And if we trying to imagine the scenario of Russian large-scale attack, the military will play a significant but not the major role. Disinformation, cyber, that's, the large-scale attack is not simply tanks or missiles. It would be very complex and very, very difficult to defend.
Yes, actually, about the importance of the cyber effect and cyber world in general. Obviously, it's a bit hard to talk about these facts because, I mean, we have national agencies which are responsible for cybersecurity, and they aren't that much open and as other agencies, just as with SBU, with Security Service of Ukraine. They report only about the finished operations, something that has been already done, close, and not about the ongoing operations. But even though we had received confirmations both from the Ministry of Interior and also of this, there is a special service which is dealing with the cybersecurity, that they are testing the service of the National Electoral Commission of Ukraine, meaning that there is a very good understanding among Ukrainian authorities that the cyber aspect might be one of the most vulnerable ones, and definitely this will be something that for sure will be threatened and attacked, because it's not only about the very unique server which is placed in Kyiv. Just imagine how the entire system is working. You have all the different electoral commissions all around Ukraine which are sending the results to Kyiv. Then you have the preliminary results. They have paper protocols, but they will be sent on physically much later, meaning that you would have at least from few hours to few days or even few weeks when you won't be able to establish the real result of the elections, because you would have to wait for all the physical protocols to arrive to Kyiv. And this is the moment, once again, of hesitation, of chaos, first of all, inside Ukraine, because you don't know the result, you can't trust the result, and so on and so forth. By the way, one of the, obviously, the narratives, or like one of the fake news stories which have been shared from time to time. And this is already something that I not only see from our monitorings and from our database, but this is also something that has been repeated by many people in my Ukrainian networks who are saying that, well, this will be the most falsified elections in Ukrainian history. Although so far we don't have grounds actually to confirm it. We don't have any kind of information from national police or from SBU saying that there is a complete destroyed system of law insurance during the elections and so on and so forth, and everything will be falsified. So even before the official results are announced, there are a lot of people who already question whether those will be legitimate and real results. And maybe one of the very real confirmations that this is actually something which is happening. A few days ago, one of the leading sociology agencies in Ukraine has published results. Once again, they were measuring the strength or the positions of political candidates, of presidential candidates. The top three remains the same. It's Zelensky, Poroshenko, and Tymoshenko. But this time they have added a new question, something that I haven't asked the people before. So normally during the presidential polls, people are asked, who would you vote for? And this time, together with this question, people were asked, but who would you think will become the president? And we see a great difference, because when people are asked who you think will become the president, almost 40% of all of them say that they think that Poroshenko will win. Meaning that, I mean, apart of the fact that most of the people who would vote for another candidate, they still think that these results won't count, meaning that there is already general perception that there might be some problems. And going back to the disinformation activities and actually the Hungarian part that we mentioned, obviously the main disinformation narratives are produced by Russia or coming from Russia. Then they are being picked up by Ukrainian proxies, or sometimes the entry point is Ukraine, but it really very much reminds the Kremlin playbook. But when it comes to the interference of other actors, other countries, so far we have only seen Hungary, who has been once again also on the very high level of the ministry of the government official. It is the minister of the cabinet of ministers of Orban, who has very actively criticized in very harsh words Ukrainian authorities, calling one of the laws which was recently passed, education law, a semi-fascist. And this is the issue of ongoing, I wouldn't say confrontation, but the issue which is very actively being debated between Ukrainian authorities and Hungarian counterparts, Romanian, Moldovan, Polish, but only with Hungary have the biggest problems, because Hungarians, they are blocking Ukrainian NATO, for example, commission. They are also trying to block Ukraine on different levels in the EU. And recently, they were the only ones, for example, from our monitoring from the recent months, they were the only ones, a part of Russians, who would attack the Ukrainian authorities in the electoral period and trying to say that this is absolute rubbish which is taking place in Ukraine, and it's absolutely unacceptable the way current Ukrainian authorities are running their country.
So I'll add that cyber is something that gives you a Swiss Army knife-like capability, right? Because IT basically manages everything. So not just elections and not just voters, but critical infrastructure. And so you can use that in so many different ways. And there's always a lot of firsts in the era of cyber war. But Ukraine has the distinction of having at least several, but I'll mention two. With the critical infrastructure attacks in Christmas 2015, someone turned off power in western Ukraine. And again, it was a months-long operation. And it's interesting if you think about it in so many ways. That in Donbass are the soldiers and the tanks, but in far western Ukraine is a very large country, so this is many kilometers away. The lights go out, right, via hacking. And so not only is it a different kind of attack, but it's in a different place, in a different time. And it's at Christmas, right? All of this is meant to send a message, right, a very important message that the tools exist to pressure you in so many different ways. Another example is there's a ransomware. Now, ransomware is when you get on your computer something that encrypts your data and then asks you for money to decrypt the data, right? So Petya was a type of ransomware. Now, what happened in Ukraine was something called NotPetya. And many businesses in Ukraine were infected with this ransomware. But we know that it wasn't really for ransom. It was the revenue generation capability was almost non-existent. It was just meant to destroy. And so that is one thing to keep in mind with cyber attacks, is it's not just information theft or denial anymore. Where hackers are going today is destruction. Right? And when you destroy, if you just take the company Maersk, right, which from Denmark, and so had about 50 servers around the world managing its operations, and all but one had the data completely destroyed. And it was only by a miracle that there was a server that was offline in Africa that they had to send physical representatives to go fetch the server and bring it back. And that, luckily, was the way in which Maersk came back online. But data destruction, it can literally run into the billions of dollars to fix the damage. And so that's why right now people are very concerned from a national security perspective about data destruction. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to come back again to the Sea of Azov and the Straits of Kerch. And this is both for you, Alexei and David. I think the most significant activity we've seen from Moscow in Ukraine, new activity in the pre-election period, was a combination of the escalation at the Straits, which you mentioned, Alexei, the attack on the Ukrainian ships. But perhaps more important than that, something which began before, which was the harrying of shipping going into and out of the Sea of Azov. Because the impact of that, just in statistics, is that has cut trade from Donbass by at least 1/3, or as much as 1/2. So a major economic impact on the part of the country, the part of Ukraine, that is most vulnerable. The incident near the Straits, as you mentioned correctly, Alexei, was an escalation. Russian forces, not hidden, openly attacked. So the reaction from the West thus far has been minimal, and I'm being polite to use that adjective. And so, David, I know you are a fire eater, so I'll ask you for your impression of the reaction in the West and what that may mean for Ukraine. I have my own thoughts, but I will come back to that after giving Alexei a chance to weigh in as well.
Yes, it has been minimal at best, and that is being generous. I agree. There has virtually been no reaction, and unless Putin sees that he is going to run into a brick wall when he engages in this kind of provocation, he will continue to do it. And we need to be, we in the West need to support Ukraine when it continues to be under direct attack. And if we can't respond to a crisis like this, then we will see a worse crisis develop, because Putin will just think he can keep going further and further. He's testing us. He's testing Ukraine. He's testing us. He's checking our resolve to see whether we will be there. There have been some ship visits to the Black Sea area. Kurt Volker, the special envoy at the State Department for the Ukrainian crisis, was just there in Odessa, I think it was. I know the UK minister was also in the region a month or so ago. That's nice, but it's nowhere near sufficient. There needs to be strong penalties imposed for this kind of activity. The very fact that these 24 sailors are being held illegally in Russia, being subjected to this humiliation of undergoing psychological tests, should outrage us and should prompt us to respond with forceful measures to do what we can to secure their release. And that's to say nothing of other Ukrainians who are being held illegally in Russia, including Mr. Sentsov and others. So every time we don't respond in a forceful way to these kinds of acts, we will see more of these acts. And then we will be even further behind. And then we will wake up one day and discover, well, how did that happen? And part of the blame will lie with us.
Alex, you want to add something here?
Yeah, you mentioned Kerch incident. There was another Kerch incident back in 2002 or three.
Three. I was in Kyiv at the time.
Yeah.
Tuzla Island.
Yeah. And two countries were very close to this violent incident. And why it is important and interesting to mention now, because at that time there was also kinetic action done by the Russians, but there were no military. Ukrainian, of course, President Kuchma deployed Ukrainian air power, conducted exercises. At the end, there were no violence. But Russia doing kinetic actions does not necessarily use its military. Back in 2003, they used Cossacks and they used this Ministry of Emergency. Also, the Kerch incident happened in November, but the Kerch crisis or Azov crisis started at least in May last year. And Russians used semi-legal instruments, stopping Ukrainian ships first and other ships under different countries' flags for very legal reason. You know, just checking whether there is illegal weapons, drugs, and so on. And at the end of the day, before the crisis, some of the ships wasted not hours but days, and it cost like thousands and thousands of dollars. Of course, it's affected Ukrainian ports on the Sea of Azov, and it was not, I mean, also incidentally, because the south of Ukraine is the most vulnerable to the Russian propaganda for many reasons. There is the biggest Russian-speaking population, and this was, again, very complex operation aimed not just preventing Ukraine from entering to Azov Sea, but also to destabilize these already vulnerable regions. And now Ukraine has or face very hard choices: either let Russia to annex Azov Sea, or to do some actions which would be perceived by the Russians and reacted by the Russians as another provocation. And I absolutely agree with you, Ambassador, that I'm afraid that we haven't seen proper understanding and proper action from the West, because Russia will not stop in Azov Sea. It's already, there are similar activities already on the western side of Crimea. So it will go further and further, and then Ukraine will be done. Other countries, Black Sea countries, will suffer, not to the same extent probably, but definitely will suffer.
I want to just make one more point here, to be precise about the danger. If you watch carefully Kremlin military activity in Ukraine and Kremlin diplomacy, you see the following. They began the operation, they took Crimea, that was quote unquote a success for them. They began the operation in Donbass, they had some initial success, and they began to talk about Novorossiya, taking the whole of south and eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian government fought back, almost took back the entire Donbass by mid-August of 2014, at which point Kremlin regular troops, the Red Army, went in and beat Ukraine at Ilovaisk. That led to sanctions, which have been painful for the Kremlin. Russian economic officials say, even now, it costs them 1 to 1.25 or even 1.5% of GDP a year. That's serious. So the Kremlin has been trying to pressure Ukraine without driving up sanctions further. As our panelists have pointed out, Putin's intervention in Ukraine has produced a strong reaction. A large majority of Ukrainians think Putin is a war criminal and no longer have fond feelings for Moscow. And there are people in Russia, including people of influence, who understand this. And recognizing the pain they've inflicted on themselves via sanctions, this has led at least twice to periods of serious negotiations. The Minsk process has not been a serious process. Moscow has not done anything there which is positive. Although the Minsk process is the vehicle by which the EU maintains sanctions, so this is important and should not be dismissed. But they've had serious talks, first with then U.S. Assistant Secretary Toria Nuland, and then now with our Special Envoy for Ukraine, Kurt Volker. But these talks only lasted for a short period of time. With Nuland, they lasted from January of 2016 until May of 2016. Why? Because in May of 2016, Donald Trump emerged as the Republican candidate, or as the likely Republican candidate in the presidential elections. So they put negotiations on halt while they waited to see what the new administration, what a possible new administration would bring. Trump came in, the Russians were very disappointed because American policy toughened, and they got more sanctions rather than less sanctions. Then they began serious negotiations with Volker when he came in the summer of 17. Those negotiations ended when? January of 18. Why? Because Putin decided he wanted to see what would happen in Ukraine's elections. So we got the presidential election coming up, and we've got the Rada election coming up in the fall. They are waiting to see what happens. Putin is hoping there will be a more sympathetic to Moscow political landscape in Ukraine. We don't know, as David pointed out, the result of the elections, but I'm willing to state here categorically that the new political landscape in Ukraine come December of this year will not be more amenable to accepting Kremlin diktat. At which point, Putin has to make a choice, either to resume serious negotiations or to escalate. The greatest strategic thinker in Ukraine is Volodymyr Rubulin. I recommend him to everyone. He had a recent piece where he talks about how Moscow has set things up on Ukraine's borders so they can escalate, you might say, immediately if they choose to. I don't know if Putin will escalate. I think there are great dangers for him. I do know this, and this is why I'm talking about the Straits of Kerch. David's exactly right that Putin is testing the West as to what he can get away with. And right now, Kerch looks like a victory for the Kremlin, for an hawkish policy. They've clearly closed the straits. They are strangling slowly Donbass economy, which poses serious economic cost on the whole country. And the West only managed to cancel a meeting between Trump and Putin at the G20 in South America. And there are going to be some sanctions coming from the EU soon on individuals involved, Russian individuals, which basically means mid-level types. Not serious. Not serious. No sanctions now mean that when Putin has to make that decision 10 or 12 months from now, he's got a reason to go in large and nasty. That doesn't mean he will. Sanctions are still taking a toll. But a serious smack at the Kremlin right now would tell him, don't go there. I apologize if this sounds like I'm preaching, but this is analysis, albeit a little bit impassioned.
John, can I just add one element to that? History can be a guide to what may come. And at the end of 2013-14, as energy prices started to decline, so did Mr. Putin's popularity rating. And the Olympics in Sochi did not give him the boost that he expected and hoped for. And what happened in Ukraine prompted him to do something drastic. His numbers, as I mentioned earlier, are going down again. In fact, his numbers are below where they were pre-2014. It's not to say that he is going to re-up on the invasion, but it should be cause for concern that where he has no solutions for Russia's current stagnation, that he may look for ways to deflect attention from what's happening at home. And that should be cause for concern in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, Belarus, frankly, anywhere, even in the United States. And so I hope we are up to the challenge.
We'll go once around the panel, then we'll turn to audience.
Yeah. Well, I not pretend that I'm a big expert on Putin, but what I learned from our Russian colleagues who know Putin pretty good, that he has at least two main objectives. First, he wants to stay in power, and second, he wants to be remembered as a great Russian leader. And in achieving these both objectives, Ukraine is something that annoys Putin very much. First, if he wants to stay in power, as you mentioned already, his popularity goes down, and the developments in Russia are not as favorable for Putin. And here is Ukraine. If Ukraine becomes one day free, democratic, European, prosperous country, it will present an alternative model for Russia, because any European country or any Baltic country is not Russia. Ukraine is something that Russia is watching closely. Secondly, if Ukraine one day becomes not a full member of NATO, but a member of Euro-Atlantic community, it will destroy completely Putin's ambition, imperial and geopolitical ambition. And that's why I think Putin will not let Ukraine to sleep calm.
Yes. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the catch straight and what happened in November, because in a way it gives us the proof that actually those disinformation activities really work. Because Russia today's slogan is question more. What disinformation activities make you actually think and feel is question everything. So even if something straightforwardly happening, you still have these hesitations. Is it real? Is it provocation? Are this footage real or also not? And so forth. Just remember what has happened in Crimea, how it was perceived. Well, there is some man without insignia, little green man, polite man, as Russian call them. Everyone was very much confused of what is going on in Crimea. Then was referendum, and the rest of the world was wondering, oh, should we consider it as a rightful referendum or not? In Donbass, it took us years. And I'm talking about Western, not only politicians, but journalists, think tankers sometimes, to publicly and officially acknowledge that this is Russian invasion in Ukraine. There were words rebels, separatists, local troops fighting Kyiv, and so on and so forth. Now in 2019, we more or less agreed on the vocabulary, although even now in the world leading Western media, you might find separatists and breakaway republics and rebels and all this stuff. But it took us few years in order to understand understand and to set the precise vocabulary and the language about what is going on in eastern Ukraine. And this time, so like with the previous times with Russia has directly attacked Ukraine, there was a great field of confusion, and people were really very much restrained of saying direct and harsh words about what is going on in reality. And this time, when the Kerch Strait happened, for the first time ever in the last 5 years, there are no green men without insignia. There are people with Russian flags, Russian soldiers, Russian sailors, and there were some people from KGB as well, from FSB. Yes, and then obviously there were Russian officials who confirmed that yes, we have seized those vessels, and Russian sailors are in Moscow prisons. This was a direct act of aggression. Even if, for example, you would be confused about Crimea and Donbas, Kerch Strait leaves no confusion. Take every single international law. What is act of aggression against the other country? Kerch Strait is a direct act of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. And we still have a reaction of people of, well, we still have to investigate, we still have to see whether it wasn't provocation or not. By the way, once again, at the very beginning I mentioned that with the StopFake we have been monitoring Russian interference, informational one, for the last 5 years. And in the middle of summer of 2018, I think it was mid of July, we already made a program specifically about Azov and about Russian narratives that started popping up in the summer of 2018 about Azov, in which Russians started accusing Ukrainians of preparing for provocations in Azov Sea. Although at the very same time, those were Russians who started bringing more military ships and more military vessels into the Sea of Azov. So there was a certain information preparation to the entire staging of the Kerch Strait as a provocation, because if you would see how Russians started to portray the event or the accident after it happened, they started accusing Ukrainian authorities, and they started accusing Poroshenko, Ukrainian servicemen, and so on and so forth, of trying to trap Russia into attacking aggressively. Although the attack of Ukrainian vessels happened in international waters, and still Crimea is Ukraine according to international law. So even if we had violated any kind of the borders coming closer to Crimean border, this is our territory, which is internationally recognized. So once again, obviously I do applaud to the diplomatic language which was used by my colleagues, but I do agree with the fact that even with all the evidence which is there, the very soft reaction leaves Ukraine very much uncomfortable.
Sure, I'll just speak maybe from the cyber side, but I think it applies in every domain. I've just been following affairs in Ukraine closely since 2014, but I think that things there are developing so quickly and positively, really. And I think that Europe is large and diverse. And I really would encourage you to see Ukraine, if you haven't been there, perhaps, as a resource and is the future, and unlimited potential, really. And I'm just speaking from the standpoint of information security and hackers, both good and bad, that I know and have talked to and interviewed. But I can see it in the wider community as well. And so that's a small encouragement for the group here, is to see Ukraine as really an important, very valuable and intelligent part of Europe's future.
Okay, you've been a very patient audience. We'll now take questions. Right here. Oh, yeah. Just speak up loud.
Okay. Well, my name is Alice Stolmeyer. I'm from Defending Democracy. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere sympathy to the people of Ukraine for being so brave. To bring this conversation Ukraine is our neighbor, but to bring it even more closer to home for the European audience here, I would like to ask, what are the lessons that we can learn for the upcoming European elections, and both in terms of the threats, but also in terms of resilience? Thank you.
Sure, I'll start. Thanks for your question. I think we have to be vigilant about interference in campaigns, attacks on individuals, support and funding for individuals. I do think for all the problems with U.S. elections, foreign funding of campaigns or candidates is illegal. That's something that I think all EU member states should adopt as well, to ban foreign funding and not have certain presidential candidates in some countries even brag about funding coming from Russia. So as much transparency as possible, and as much focus on ensuring that the candidates are in charge of their own campaigns and are not puppets for outside forces.
So already from the experience of several elections which took part in Europe, not only the EU elections, but mainly, I think one of the very well studied elections were the ones in Italy. And there was very beautiful analysis of how actually on Twitter the narratives which were mainly produced by Sputnik were later distributed by bots and trolls, and suddenly they took over the public discourse in Italy. So, for example, the Sputnik Italy was producing narratives which became very much popular and took over the public discourse in Italy, which were very much preferential for certain political forces, which later won the election and now say almost every single week that we should lift sanctions against Russia and should continue the strategic and close partnership with Russia and so on and so forth. So it gives us the hint that quite often Russians don't need to directly support any kind of candidate or public. They're investing into certain narrative which can be very much comfortable for certain political forces. And this is, just supporting someone in white clothes, because then you can't accuse foreign media, for example, giving too much time or too much attention to a certain candidate, because it will be too easy to accuse them of the interference. But they are just talking about what is concerning people in the country. But I think that one of the main lessons from the learning curve of how Ukraine has been attacked by Russia in disinformation field in the last 5 years is that there will be less and less direct attacks or direct inputs coming from Russia. There will be more and more local networks of NGOs, of activists, whatever color they might have, different politicians, political parties, movements, and so on and so forth, that, when you investigate them, it will be possible to find connections with Russia or Russian proxies in Europe. But it means that Russians are becoming much smarter in a way that they know if there will be a direct Russian interference that can be checked and that can be investigated, it will immediately kill the popularity of the movements or politicians or narratives that they support. That is why there should be a bigger and closer look into the domestic situation of given countries and investigating all the local networks which are active in those countries.
Thank you. Okay, question over here.
Human Rights Without Frontiers. I think there is an important actor that has not been mentioned and that makes Ukraine quite vulnerable to the interference of Moscow. It's Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church. In Ukraine, you have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which represents 12,000 parishes in communion with Moscow for several centuries, and on the other side you have the new Orthodox Church with only 5,000 parishes. Moreover, Patriarch Kirill has just said that he would like to go and pray with his believers in Ukraine, which is a direct call for them to vote some candidates that are that would be more friendly than others in the elections. How do you comment on this issue?
Sadly, the Moscow Patriarchate, a religious organization, is an instrument of Kremlin national security policy. And Patriarch Kirill had his own klitschko as someone who reported if wasn't a member of the special services in Russia. This is a very sad situation, and the Moscow Patriarchate has been used to advance Kremlin imperial interests in Ukraine. But point of fact, the recent recognition by the first patriarch of all Orthodox churches, the Patriarch of Constantinople, of Ukraine as an independent, legitimate, canonical, to use the religious phrase, Orthodox Church, has greatly strengthened the churches of Ukraine. It's created a single Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which consists of the old Kiev Patriarchate, the old Autocephalous Church, and an increasing number of parishes and a few bishops from the Moscow Patriarchate have joined. Over hundreds have joined since the announcement, the tomos from the Patriarch of Constantinople. In Ukraine, the churches do not belong to the government. They do not belong to the ecclesiastical body. The churches belong to their parishioners and the communities that run those parishes. And in hundreds of cases, churches have moved from the Moscow Patriarchate because Ukrainians understand that they have been an instrument used by the Kremlin to subordinate Ukraine. And I think we'll see more of this. There was and is concern in Ukraine that Moscow would seek to create a provocation or two. And this statement by Kirill is, I'd say, a more public version of that. I suspect Ukraine will be able to deal with it. They understand Poroshenko's been strong on this, and various prelates in Ukraine, the Ukrainian church, and for that matter in Constantinople, have been strong on this. No coercion will be used. Each parish makes up its own mind. But in Ukraine, again, a majority of people, a large majority of people understand that the Moscow Patriarchate has been an instrument of Kremlin foreign policy. And let me just tell you one anecdote. A prominent businessman whose origins and activities in the East told me, this would have been back in the late fall, when the tomos, there was decision was expected but had not been made, that when that happens, he and his whole family are going to go be rebaptized in the Ukrainian church. He had been Moscow Patriarchate. And he also expressed a willingness to help build new churches, saying, of course, any parishes that want to remain with the Moscow Patriarchate should be free to do so. Okay, question over, lady over here.
Thank you. Irina Solmer, news agency Interfax Ukraine. As we know, the main assessment if this election will be free and fair will be given by OSCE monitoring mission. I would like to know if you gonna to work with them. Do you plan to share with them your assessment and conclusion? And this is the same apply for Ukrainian authority. Do you plan to work with them? And do you see the way how you can protect this election from meddling? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. ODIHR, the part of OSCE that monitors and observes elections, will have a very important say on how the election turns out. We will be in touch with them. We will follow their assessments, their conclusions that they will release after what is likely to be a first round and then a probable second round. They tend to get more focused on the domestic part of it. It's not clear to me how much ODIHR will get into foreign interference, but if it is an issue in their assessment, then we absolutely will factor that in. Your question also leads me to a point about the task force as a whole. It's important to stress, I consider Ukraine part of Europe, but the task force is made up of Ukrainians and other Europeans as well as Americans. This is a multinational effort. It is driven by Ukrainians. It was Victor Pinchuk's idea to do this in the first place, and we are part of this to help provide additional resources and credibility to the effort, and ODIHR certainly does that when it comes to assessing elections as well.
My name is Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. First, I need to make some short remark on Alexei statement. You could
Very
be
short.
absolutely sure that Ukraine will not go down, just because, you know, from my observation, people are decisive enough to fight, and it is not possible to defeat the people who have such a decision made. And now the question, we today have had a lot about some kind of Russian narratives coming into the international community and Ukrainian society as well. From your point of view, how flexible and decisive and ready the Ukrainian government is to react or into that kind of threats. In that famous Stratcom, did they learn at least how to speak to society, to the international community with one voice? And the second question, if I may, we have in Ukraine a very interesting phenomena when, for example, we have a Russian newspaper Izvestia, called Izvestia in Ukraine, and it's already like Ukrainian edition. They use sometimes that editions, a lot of them, you know that more than better than I do, for direct spreading the Russian narratives. What to do, what Ukrainian society could do with all this stuff, considering that we are staying in a state of war in the information sphere as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. I think I will start with the second one because actually this Russian proxies or Ukrainian certain websites, TV channels or newspapers that have been registered in Ukraine under Ukrainian legal system but who are actively pushing through Russian narratives. This has been very active subject for discussion in the expert community, how to tackle them. And there is no easy answer, and I think that there is nothing civil society can do. There is only legal system that can do. The legal system of the checkups, I mean, the legal system, the legal framework of how the newspapers are being financed, how they are registered. Are there any connections to people who represent the aggressor state? Because Russia has been officially recognized in Ukraine as aggressor state, and this was the ground for banning observers coming in Ukraine. With Vesti, there was a procedure which was started. I mean, the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, came to their office and found a great amount of, I mean, there were millions of hryvnias in cash, which were simply stored in some wardrobe. And still the newspaper wasn't able to present the justification where this money were coming from. Because when we're talking about Russian disinformation mechanisms and schemes, shadiness, gray zone, grain financing, and Russia always come together. This is the way we were able to investigate how certain political parties in the European Union are being financed. Because if you see the undeclared, or like, you know, when you question several sources of financing and you start investigating them, quite often they lead to Russia. But we need an investigation. If Ukraine wants to remain a country which upholds the democratic process, it doesn't matter how much we don't like certain narratives of the newspaper. They are registered under Ukrainian law, and we only need a legal procedure. And it's about how the investigation into their financing is done. Because so far, all the examples that we had, both in Ukraine but also in other countries, the decision to shut down several newspapers, TV stations, but mostly to prove that certain politicians are working with Russia, was thanks to the principle follow the money. If we follow the money and we can establish the links to Russia, only then we can react. Before that, I don't support personally, you know, just raiding offices, throwing stones and so on and so forth. Many people have been repeating to us in Ukraine, but also outside, that while fighting Russia, we shouldn't become Russia in their oppressive matters. When it comes to communications, in the recent months, I think Ukrainian authorities are too much preoccupied with the internal problems and with internal electoral campaigns and what will happen to them, for example, or how to work with the current candidates. And there haven't been that much of work with international society. That is why I really do value the initiative that we currently represent, that brings together or collects all the different elements of disinformation, kinetic or cyber activities in Ukraine. And our products are mostly in English. So we're informing and educating, first of all, the Western society about what is going on in Ukraine, but also giving them the important lessons that can be learned from this current electoral campaign, which later can be used in other countries as well. When it comes to Stratcom, there is no one Stratcom. There were different initiatives. There was Stratcom, there is Ministry of Information Policy in Ukraine. There also has been this One Voice policy, which was started by Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and people were working in different ministries so far, although we have the Doctrine on Information Security, which has very strong element on coordination of efforts, and obviously how to enable Ukraine to talk with one voice, with very clear messages with the world. Unfortunately, this is still not happening. This is still something that Ukraine should very much improve.
James Wilson, I'm the founder of the Kiev-Brussels Network. First of all, Ambassador Hopes, I'd like to congratulate you on this initiative. It's very much needed. We have elections, as you know, in the European Parliament at the end of May, and still many people don't see the importance of the Ukrainian elections and the impact that it may have in Europe. For example, Katerina referred to Russian money being fed into political parties in Europe. If we look at Italy, Matteo Salvini, the Deputy Prime Minister, he doesn't even conceal it. He gets himself photographed in the Red Square wearing a Putin t-shirt. And okay, there has been some investigation, but this is what I wanted to appeal to you about. You know, follow the money, as Katerina said. We need to know that the campaign expenditure of the candidates in Ukraine is properly monitored. It's no surprise that the three leading candidates are either the richest oligarchs in Ukraine, or the top five oligarchs, or sponsored by one of them. And there are many good candidates lower down the list in the opinion polls who do not have the same resources. So I would like to appeal to you to monitor the campaign expenditure of the individual candidates, and also to devote resources to investigation of the manipulation of European politicians by funds from Moscow.
Thank you for your comment and question. I agree with you 100%. We don't quite have the means to track the expenditures of candidates in the campaigns. That would be a very resource-intensive exercise to undertake. It's not to take away from your recommendation. I agree with it completely, but it's a little beyond our capabilities to do in this project. I do think if we think about the Rada elections coming up in the fall, that would certainly be something for us to consider incorporating into a similar kind of task force for that. So point very well taken. Thank you.
One small comment on that. Facebook, if you've seen in the news, is trying to currently prohibit foreign money coming into political ads nationally within the Facebook space. For example, in Ukraine, right? They'll try and prevent Russian money or foreign money coming into to support advertisements within the Ukrainian Facebook space.
Okay, question over here and then over there.
I'm Baudouin Van Umberg. I'm a freelance journalist. I'd like more details.
Freedom House or freelance?
Freelance.
Freelance. Okay.
I'd like more detail on the Western useful ideas. How can we spot them?
Useful idiots. Oh, useful idiots. Do you want to try that?
Sure. Go ahead. You want to, Alexei, I'll start. Or you start.
Asking also your question, recommendations. Be aware of the Russian observers. Be aware of the Russian tourists. Don't be paranoid about Russians. There are plenty of very good people. But coming to your question, sir, Russian observers doesn't mean, or Russian proxies, just observers sent from Russia. I saw and I shared with my colleagues very good report done by the students of Ukrainian Security Service Academy. I mean, it's available from open sources, and there are very interesting links of the observers, Western observers, who come to Russia to places like, not only to Russia, to places like Crimea, Abkhazia, South Ossetia as electoral observers. And those cadets, they tracked their connections. So they are among you, and they have connections to political parties. There was a separate couple of pages about Italy, like Russian, how it's called, Россотрудничество, Russian cooperation, Россотрудничество. They, so friendly to left radicals, right radicals, and if you have, it doesn't take a lot of time. Just to follow some links, you can also see on the internet. I think it's available, and About Russian tourists, again, I salute Ukrainian security service because they discovered, I think, more than 1,000 Russian agents after this Skripal incident in Salisbury. You know, they show their passports, fake passports issued in the same authority, and the Ukrainian security service discovered, like, as I said, about more than 1,000 people who received passports, like with very similar numbers from the same authority, and they still traveling to Europe. If they travel during the elections, maybe they are not just to see Salisbury for other purposes.
So I'd like to also say that the best propaganda, I think, always has a kernel of truth, right? It's not a lie, but you're just exacerbating existing tensions. For example, we know now that in the state of Texas, Russian trolls and bots were supporting both sides, right, on social divisive social issues. So there are a lot of useful idiots if they're uneducated and they're willing to play a role, right, for perhaps a foreign power, and then that goes to the internet and cyber. There's only one internet and one cyberspace, really, and it covers the whole planet. And so it's really easy to run information operations across your border, and it's very hard to stop them.
Question over here. Yes. David Schmirik, I'm the president of the Slavonic Europe organization in Brussels. We are opening now in the spring the Slavonic House in Brussels for all 13 Slavonic countries. And I want to actually one comment here on the discussion as some observer. I find this is extremely negativist, actually.
Extremely?
Extremely negativist, actually. I'm missing something constructive and positive about Ukraine. I have the impression there's been nothing set up, nothing mentioned, like a constructive future program here. I know discussion is about something different, maybe, but anyway. Actually, the founder of Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, said one, anger is not a program. Therefore, you have, Mrs. Crook, she's coming from Ukraine, you have to have something positive for the future, and that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
This project is not about Ukraine per se, about its prospects, excuse me, what's happening there now and its prospect. It's about efforts from outside to prevent Ukraine from running a free and fair election and establishing a stable government following that election. You might see that there is a presupposition. The basis for this project is something quite positive. Ukraine demonstrated in 2014 on the Maidan that it rejected authoritarianism. It's demonstrated since then the ability to run a democracy in the face of invasion and in the face of a massive effort, a hybrid effort, disinformation, financial manipulation, cyber operations to maintain an open society. That in itself is an extraordinary achievement. And so we didn't think we needed to repeat that here. This is negative, as would have been an analysis of Hitler's foreign policy circa 1937 or 1938. And I'm not comparing Putin to Hitler. Hitler was a world historic monster. Putin is a mini monster. So we don't want to make too much of him. But still what he's doing is dreadful.
And if I could just add, underlying, I think, this project is an effort by the Kremlin and Putin to prevent Ukraine from succeeding. And the very fact that it's Ukrainians who want to expose outside interference in their election is a positive reflection on Ukraine. The fact that Ukrainians are going to the polls to choose their leader and we don't know the outcome is a positive reflection on Ukraine. That Ukrainians are able to conduct democratic processes even though they are, not by their choice, at war with Mr. Putin, is a positive reflection on Ukraine. Despite the Kerch Strait incident, when there was concern, I confess I shared some of this concern that that could be used as a pretext to postpone the election. That didn't happen. The Rada acted as an important check on that, imposed limitations, and the election is going to take place in, 2-3 weeks. So I think that speaks incredibly well of Ukraine. Ukrainians, as I mentioned before, twice in a decade turned out in the streets to demand better from their government. I don't know of another country that can claim that. So I think the underlying theme of what we're doing here is to look at efforts from outside that are negative and nefarious to prevent the positive and the successful from really taking root in the country.
And following up on the positivistic approach of Ukrainians, positivism, in my regard, and constructive attitude very much connects to the very active things that you are doing. And what Ukrainians have been doing ever since 2014 is standing the ground and defending the country. So we are very much optimistic about Ukraine because we don't give up on it. We went on Maidan Square when we wanted to prevent Ukraine from falling into authoritarianism. Many Ukrainians have joined volunteering battalions at the very first days of war because they didn't want their country to collapse and they wanted Ukraine to remain independent. And millions of Ukrainians as volunteers donated their money, their time, because they are optimistic about the future of this country. So we have a lot of great positive attitude towards Ukraine. We Ukrainians and obviously our friends, but we will be even more positive when the war is over and Crimea and Donbass return to Ukraine. That will be the happiest day for us.
I think we probably used all the time, but one more question? Okay, last one.
My name is Oscar de Bistoven. Mr. Kramer, my question is for you. What next? You talked about forceful measures on our part to counter Russian aggression. What should these measures be? Let's assume that not a pro-Kremlin, but a candidate comes up victorious after the election and tries to accommodate the Kremlin, right? Trying to accede to some of the Russian demands and to stabilize the country, but dragging it slowly away from the Western influence. What should the Western response be? And Mr. Kramer, you talked about forceful measures. What specifically do you have in mind? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I think the direction that Ukraine's next president, or if re-elected, the current president will pursue will be for Ukrainians to decide. Ukrainians have demonstrated they're not shy about expressing their views. They'll go out in the streets to make their views very loud and clear. So I don't know that we have a role, we and the other parts of Europe and in the United States have a role if the next president decides to pursue some form of negotiations. That'll be for Ukrainians to decide whether that's the right path or not to pursue. For us, I think it is important to continue to ramp up pressure on the Kremlin and its cronies, because if sanctions basically stay where they are, then Russia can adjust to them and get used to them. They don't like them. We've seen numerous efforts by the Kremlin to get sanctions lifted. But sanctions are not just punitive, they're psychological. And the target of sanctions has to know and understand that if he doesn't change his behavior, he's going to get hit with more sanctions until he does change his behavior. And the mistake we have made is basically to be at a standstill. Yes, sanctions have gone up a little bit, but not to the point of affecting the behavior of the target of sanctions. So I'm certainly not advocating for a military response. Nobody is. Ukrainians aren't asking for American soldiers to fight their war for them, but they are asking for defensive weapons so that they can defend themselves. And I give the current administration in the United States credit for agreeing to provide Javelin missiles, and there's talk about additional defensive military equipment at sea to help Ukraine. So there are many things we can do to help Ukraine defend itself and to try to impose some costs on the country that has invaded Ukraine, which is Russia, and on the regime that is responsible for the worst violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity since the end of World War II, and that's the Putin regime. So the West absolutely has a responsibility to step up in this case, because as we've said throughout our 2 hours here, if we don't, it's only going to be repeated, and in fact will be worse the next time.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming. And again, ukraineelects.org to follow what's going on a daily basis.